Hello, this video is going to be about the antinomies of action from the third chapter of Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. I want to really just focus on the idea of the antinomies of reason in this video. Very important concept. We've discussed that in a situation of oppression, it's always one human being who is oppressing others. One is not oppressed by natural objects. A rock or a tree, something like that, doesn't oppress you. Other people do that. Why? Well, because they can use their freedom to deny you yours, where your freedom, if you're being oppressed, is thrown back on you and rendered impotent. That you can only use your freedom in the satisfaction of the ends of another person who is cutting off your future from its own possibilities. You can't pursue your own ends, your own goals, because your future is being closed off by the freedom of another person coming in and acting on you to coerce you and manipulating you into doing what they want rather than pursuing your own interests. And of course, they're doing it so that you will be an instrument for them, that you will be doing what they want and helping them to achieve their goals. You'll be acting in their interest instead of your own under this regime of oppression. Now, of course, eventually this becomes sort of intolerable for people, and the question of rebellion against it emerges. But this raises an interesting problem, because insofar as the oppressor is engaging their freedom to oppress, the problem arises that when I rebel against the oppressor, I'm denying their freedom. Our freedoms are like clashing, and this is why it's an antinomy. It's an impasse, right? I can't get out from under oppression without violating the freedom of my oppressor, right? And Beauvoir points out at several times, like, won't the oppressor say, well, what about my freedom? You know, you're impinging my freedom, and so on and so forth. So the question then becomes how to justify this rebellion. Now again, Beauvoir has said what would be preferable, of course, is to appeal to this freedom in order to convert your oppressor and win them over and justify yourself as a human being in their eyes. That would, of course, be ideal. But this is very much an uphill battle because, of course, it's in the oppressor's interest to deny your humanity. If they have to grant your humanity, then they can't oppress you anymore. Because we can see the clear sort of moral failure of that. So it can be very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to do that. That leaves the oppressed with the option of acting on the facticity of their oppressor, which rebelling against them more or less violently and forcing them to liberate the oppressed class. Forcing their hand, so to speak. But again, this is where the antinomy arises. And the antinomy is coming up in a lot of ways because of the influence of Kant on existentialism. So if you recall, in Kant, one formula of the categorical imperative is the principle of humanity. Always treat humanity, whether in yourself or other people, as an end in itself and never as a means to an end. Okay, don't use people. And this is an imperative that commands universally, fulfills the principle of universality. And so I should never treat a person as a means to an end. But when the oppressed class has to act upon the facticity of the oppressor in order to win their liberation, they are exactly treating them as an end, as a means. They're acting on them in order to secure their own freedom. So again, this is where this antinomy arises, where the freedoms cannot be reconciled with one another, that it becomes one person's going to have to lose in order for the other person to win. Now, for Beauvoir, the most straightforward way of justifying this is that the oppressor has already denied and negated the oppressed. The powerful one has already exhausted their freedom in the denial of another person, and so the freedom of the oppressed class has already been violated. It's always being violated at every turn, at every instant where the freedom of the oppressed class is being manipulated and forced into the interests and to serve the ends of the oppressor. That is already a violence to them and an affront to their freedom, right? So if the oppressor cannot recognize the humanity of the other and reciprocate the view of each other as beings for themselves who have their own ends and projects and everything, then they really leave, in some sense, no alternative for the oppressed class, the ones who have been harmed under the system of oppression. And so their violence against the oppressed becomes justified because the oppressed class have already denied them, right? It's not quite a logic of self-defense. There is another tact you can take where the oppressed class is defending themselves, right? That violence is being done to them, they're being harmed, and so rebellion is a kind of defensive maneuver to stop the harm, stop the ongoing harm, right? The way that Beauvoir is doing it is a little bit different than a straightforward sort of self-defense claim, though I think you can talk about self-defense when you talk about the rebellion of the oppressed. The violation of the freedom of the other is so outrageous, according to Beauvoir, that the oppressed almost has a moral obligation to put an end to it. They're almost, in the name of freedom, and the freedom of everybody, they're almost called upon to put an end to their depression in principle, not strictly out of self-defense, but to stop the egregious violation of freedom being committed by the oppressor. So again, it's not quite a straightforward self-defense kind of argument. And it's rooted in, this is one reason why Beauvoir has been giving us and sketching out different arguments why freedom has a kind of value. It has a kind of absolute value insofar as it's immanent to the human condition, and it is the very condition of our projects and the desires and so on. Without freedom, we have no ability to create ends and pursue them and so on and so forth. So because freedom is the immanent condition of the possibility of having any project, it takes on this absolute value. That's one, I think, probably the strongest version of the argument that Beauvoir provides for this, right? So because that principle is being violated and denied, the freedom of everybody is being compromised, because the oppressor is also sort of exhausting their own freedom. They've rendered themselves dependent and parasitic on the freedom of others. It's remember that language of being vampiristic. It sucks the freedom of others in order to pursue its own ends. So it's not a self-sufficient freedom. It's no longer a freedom sort of for itself, so to speak, because it's rendered itself dependent upon the others whose freedom it uses up for its own ends, so to speak, who it exhausts. So there's kind of multiple wrongs being done across the board that justify the rebellion of the oppressed class against the people who are oppressing them. But remember, this doesn't resolve the problem. It's an antinomy, right? It pits. Oppression pits the freedom of others against one another. Under the conditions of authenticity, our freedoms open possibilities to each other, right? We exist in a reciprocal relationship in which we open each other to possibilities, we enable each other's projects, we are helpful to one another, we are solicitous to one another to pursue our own ends in a mutually beneficial way. There's this kind of dignity and reciprocity there, where our freedoms are expansive for one another, where my freedom is aided by the freedom of the other. But under the system of oppression, that openness gets closed off, and freedom is no longer something that's opening, but rather is something that's closing. It becomes not a possibility or something that enables me, but it becomes a limitation on me. And so freedoms get pitted against one another. And the only way one can rise to the top in that kind of situation is through the negation of the other. Reconciliation under those conditions are not possible, and again, that's why it's an antinomy. They're at a loggerheads, they're contradicting one another, and one is wrapped up in the negation and the violation of the other. And so under those conditions, it's either convert them back to that position of openness and reciprocity, or annihilate them and prevent them from exercising their freedom to the disadvantage of you. And these are the philosophical grounds, again, within which sort of violent insurrection will be justified. When a people revolt and stage a revolution against their oppressors, part of what justifies them is this role of freedom that gets brought up. Right. Again, pacifism is cool and all. It's preferable and is to be desired in the event that we can get the oppressor to hear us and win them over to our cause. But in the event that it's not possible, revolution and rebellion then against oppression would be justified in Beauvoir's eyes, exactly on the grounds that I've just sort of outlined there. So I think I've hit upon the sort of the key philosophical components of the antinomies of action. This is a really important part of the book, and in a lot of ways the book has been working up to this point. So this is the culmination of a lot of work that Beauvoir has been doing from the very beginning to strike out on this argument within the section on the antinomies of action. So I flagged this as a really significant section of the book, and I think one that deserves careful reading. I've really just sort of sketched here the basic points of argumentation in this section, so it's certainly worth revisiting, and there are details that I am for sure glossing over and sort of dropping out. But I did just want to hit on what I take to be the most philosophically important and salient ideas within the antinomies of action. Again, I think a kind of culmination or climax to the text that brings together a lot of threads that Beauvoir has been arguing throughout. Okay, so we'll stop here, and the end for this text is drawing very close, so we don't have too much more to go with the Ethics of Ambiguity. And I hope you'll continue through with me until the end of this text, which I really find to be a very fruitful and rewarding text that I return to pretty often. Okay, so thanks for your attention, and as always, I will see you in the next video.